It is now my great pleasure to welcome one of our beloved friends, the Reverend Dr. Paul S. Johnson. He holds the Doctor of Ministry and Divinity degrees from Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago and has served UU congregations in several states, including us here. After leaving Shelter Rock on Long Island, he served as a developmental minister at Treasure Coast UU in Stuart and served as president of the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association and a member of the UUA's Commission on Social Witness, and a board member of Meadville Lombard. His wife, Carol, is retired from a 30-year career as a clinical social worker with the Department of Veterans Affairs, and his daughter, Kristin, works as an advertising firm in Manhattan, and their son, David, is an architect in Venice. Reverend Johnson, it is wonderful to have you back with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Beth. It's great to be back with you all again via Zoom. I have a Unitarian Universalist minister colleague who grew up in the Jewish religious tradition. And before going to seminary to prepare for the UU ministry, he worked for a time in his uncle's business. At one point, they had significant differences about how the business was being run, and they had many knockdown, drag-em-out arguments. And finally, my ministerial colleague quit in a huff. They became deeply alienated for several years. And it was particularly embarrassing at the holiday times when the family would get together and they would not speak to each other, or even didn't even want to be in the same room with each other. But finally, my ministerial colleague said, I'm going to ask for forgiveness. And so he did. He owned up to his part in their estrangement, and his uncle accepted his apology. And his approach was well thought out, I thought, because he knew that it was his uncle's understanding that during the Jewish holidays, high holy days, the tradition was that if someone sincerely asks for forgiveness and pledges to change in the season of high holy days, one is duty bound to offer that forgiveness. And if one does not, one's name will not be in the book of life during the coming year. So his uncle did grant his forgiveness. The whole process worked. They began to enjoy each other. They don't have to avoid each other at family gatherings anymore. And I love that story. Perhaps you do as well. It wasn't easy for my friend to take the first step in asking forgiveness, but he screwed up his courage and he did it with good result. Now, I wish I'd asked my friend if the uncle owned up to his part in their estrangement. I don't know if he did or not, but I think that often happens when someone takes a step of asking forgiveness that the other person reciprocates in certain situations. It reminded me of a situation where one of my brothers at one point was discussing with our father a difficulty he was having in his marriage. And my father, wanting to give some advice in a friendly way, said, well, you realize that one of the most important phrases in a marriage is, I'm sorry. And my brother said, I know, and I've been waiting to hear those words from her for a long time. It takes discipline. It takes a risk to say these words and to be the first one to do it. Now, I don't know if it was very hard for the uncle to forgive, but he did it. Forgiveness, I believe, is the resolute overcoming of the anger and resentment that are naturally directed toward a person who has done an injury to us. I think it's very important to realize that forgiveness is not condoning what the person has done. It's not excusing it. And ideally, it involves the 3 R's, repentance, remorse, and restitution, if any is due. It's not always an immediate thing that one feels forgiving, but it's a process that involves willfully acting in ways that will mend a relationship and open it to the future. It enables us to get out of a stuck position of resentment and alienation. I remember back in my seminary days that I had the privilege of taking 2 classes with the most prominent ethicist in our UU tradition of the 20th century, James Luther Adams, who had the privilege of being at Harvard the same time as the great philosopher Alfred North Whitehead was there. And I remember one day in class, he said that Whitehead said to them that this tradition of forgiveness was a remarkable Jewish invention. The invention that the future was not closed, but was open. It was open to the possibility of forgiveness. Now, having said all this, with these harmonics for forgiveness, I want to say that sometimes in some religious traditions, it is believed that anger or resentment are always alien, hurtful, or dangerous, or even sinful. That was the case in the evangelical Christian tradition I grew up in, that even to have these feelings of resentment or anger were considered to be sinful. And I don't agree with that. I think that resentment and anger supports a useful social function, that of enforcing the rules of morality. And I think that anger and resentment are very natural when we've been violated, when the rights which we inherently have been seriously hampered. I remember a number of years ago in a former congregation, a woman asked my advice as to whether or not she should forgive her husband, who had severely beaten her several times. He was out of their home at the time, but he wanted to come back and was begging her for forgiveness. She was really worried about this, but she felt so terribly guilty that she couldn't, in her heart of hearts, forgive him and welcome him back because he had beaten her so many times. And I said to her, it's not a failure on your part to have these feelings of anger, resentment. In fact, I think you ought to pay attention to them. Has he done anything while he's been out of your home to get any help with dealing with his severe anger? And she said he hadn't. There are ways that people can get help with this through psychotherapy or other ways to understand their own anger. And he had not done this. So I said, don't feel guilty because of your anger and resentment. It's well placed and it may save you from even being killed. Now, I think it's important to realize that I'm not, putting up a banner in favor of resentment and anger, but it can be a problem if it becomes debilitating and becomes a supreme feature of our lives. Of course, it should be attenuated if at all possible. And one of the ways to do this, of course, is to get help and maybe get another idea about how you can deal with your situation. And I love so much a book I read a number of years ago by a woman by the name of Barbara Flanagan, who entitled her book, Forgiving the Unforgivable. She claims in the book that so much of the talk about forgiveness deals with the ideal situation in which there is a transaction that can be arranged where someone expresses remorse and repentance and restitution. But so many times in our society, serious injury does not involve a situation where that's possible. What do you do? What do you do? We all know that, as I mentioned earlier, anger and resentment can build and be nursed. People can build their lives around it. Continued resentment and anger are linked to psychological pain, burnout, even physical illness. What should you do? Well, she suggested you get some help. Might be psychotherapy. It might be getting another way of looking at your situation by opening up to someone that you trust, which the woman I mentioned earlier did in regards to her husband wanting to come back after many occasions of abuse. But in her book, she discusses the situation of a woman who had experienced incest by her father when she was a young girl. Her father would not own up to it. She was told by her church that she had to forgive her father, but she couldn't bring herself to do so, and she felt terribly guilty. But over time, working with an understanding psychotherapist, she realized that her anger was justified and well placed, and over time, she was able to surmount this, so it was not such an overwhelming feature of her life. I remember I was helped by an understanding lawyer one time in sort of the same way. When I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, I lived in a large house which had where the landlord and his wife lived there, and there were 3 other tenants that they rented to. And one morning, I came out to the front of our house there, and I saw that one of the tenants had hit my car, the back quarter panel, the night before, and just demolished it. And I could tell it was his car because of the color of the paint that had come off, and the letters COMET, Comet, which was the car that he owned, had come off and was right by my car. But he never mentioned anything to me about it. And so I left a note in his box and said, I'd like to talk to you about it. And he said, well, I get off work about 11 and I'll be home before 12. Why don't we talk about it? So it was a March night in Minnesota, very chilly. And I met him as he came home that night. We went out to look at the car, and he refused to accept responsibility. He said, I didn't do it. And he took the flashlight in his hand that he had in his hand and started hitting me over the head with it. And so I grabbed him, and down we went into the street, which was strewn with cinders, in Minnesota, which was one way of helping cars maneuver through the snow. And my shirt was torn off, and we struggled. I finally got on top of him and was going to run to get in the front door and lock it, but he caught me before I could do that. And he took out a switchblade knife. And he said, I'm going to kill you, you SOB. And he chased me for at least 4 blocks. I was able to outrun him. Can you imagine that? It was about, midnight in a rather genteel neighborhood in Minnesota. And there I was running for my life. But he finally gave up because I was able to outrun him. And so eventually I went back to the front door. I was going to sneak in and get up to my room. And he was waiting on the first floor landing with that knife to get me. And he chased me out. And luckily for some reason, I had not locked my car. And I got in my car and locked the door so he couldn't get at me. And then I waited for a while, rang the doorbell to get the landlord's attention, went out in the street. So if he came out, I could outrun him again. And the landlord came in and we called the police, and I had to make a citizen's arrest. On the way out, he kicked in going down the stairwell, kicked in the wall, and caused a lot of damage as the police dragged him out. And I had to go and swear out a complaint the next day at the courthouse and was told that eventually this would come to trial and I'd be called as a witness. Now, he was kicked out of the house where we were both living and had to find another place to stay. Every night when I came home, I was worried that he was gonna chase me again, so I had to be very careful. I did take him to small claims court and got a judgment against him to pay for my car, but he didn't pay it. And so I had to, have the sheriff kind of share his wages. And I finally got the money for it. But I waited and waited to hear about when it would come to trial, the case. And finally, one day after, I called, they said, well, it has been settled out of court. It's been plea bargained for disturbing the peace with a $50 fine. I was furious. I couldn't believe it. What does it take to have something more significant than simple assault and a $50 fine when someone threatens you? I had my face was all scraped up, and I had contusions and everything, and I was going to be in a friend's wedding, his best man, in a few days, so I had to go to that wedding with my face festooned with all of these sores, or at least scabs, from what he had done to me. So I was furious. And when especially found out that it was only a $50 fine and disturbing the peace. So eventually I consulted a lawyer and I said, I lost time at school from this. I had medical expenses. I want to sue this guy. I don't think $50 fine covers it. And he heard what I had to say, and he said, well, Mr. Johnson, he said, let me get this straight. He had to spend a night in jail. He lost his place to live, probably lost his security deposit where he was living to cover the cost of the damage he caused. He had to hire a lawyer. He had to wait all of those weeks on pins and needles as to what would happen to him. He eventually had to pay for your car. He's a short order cook. That was very expensive for him. He looked at me and he said, Mr. Johnson, I think you have gotten your pound of flesh. And he said, besides, why would you want to have anything more to do with such a violent person? I think you should just let this go. And his wise counsel lifted the burden of that resentment and extreme anger. And I have to say that I really, from that point on, didn't lose any more sleep about it. I said to myself, I'm not going to let him control my psychological well-being the way he's been doing it. And it was a wonderful, almost a miraculous process. I don't know if you want to call that forgiveness, but it was one way of saying I'm giving up my hope for a better past, and I'm going to live into the future without having this hanging over me. It was an amazing process. I think so many times also, of course, we have difficulty forgiving ourselves when we've made a mistake. I remember when I became Unitarian Universalist minister, my father was so upset and angry with me that I would lead people astray on the way to hell as a UU minister. And so we had so many acrimonious discussions about theology and belief, and in which we said some very difficult and hard things and angry things to each other. Well, he suffered from congestive heart failure. At one point, he had spent a time in the hospital, was quite thought maybe be close to death. And so my wife, Carol, and I, with our newborn son, David, we went to Minnesota to visit with him. because we felt it might be the last time he could visit with our son, and that we could visit with him. Remember the last day I was with him, I wanted to ask for forgiveness for some of the things that I'd said, and wanted to express my love for him, and wanted to say that I had learned a lot from him in terms of life in general, but also in terms of ministry. But I didn't dare do it because I was afraid that our last time together before his death would involve an argument and stirring up of hard feelings. And so we talked about pleasantries, and we went home, and in 2 weeks, he was dead. And I felt terrible. I felt so guilty. Why wasn't I able to take that risk? Death is so final, and he never knew my final feelings. He never knew my true feelings of love and respect because of all the anger we had shared at each other and with each other. And so I was feeling terrible. I was beating myself up. I had trouble sleeping. I had trouble eating. A woman from my congregation called and said, "How are things going, Paul, after your father's death?" And I said, "They're not going well." And I shared with her my unease of spirit and the guilt I was feeling. And she said, "Paul," she's a very wise woman. She said, "I can understand why you didn't want to get into that the last time you were with your father." And even more important, she said, he was probably feeling the same way. Both of you were on pins and needles. It's very understandable why you acted the way you did. And it was as if I had been forgiven by Daphne Holden, and a weight lifted off of me because I was able to share this with her. And even though I couldn't square things with my father, I somehow had a better insight and have been able to live without that crushing feeling of guilt. Interestingly, along the same line, my sister died 2 years ago now this month from cancer. And the last time I talked to her, we were discussing my father, and she made mention of how we had such a difficult relationship and so much resentment and anger. But I didn't want her to die feeling that was the only aspect of the relationship. And I pointed all the things I appreciated about my father and some of the very special things he did for me out of love. And I'm really glad I had the opportunity before she passed. So those are the words I want to share with you this morning about forgiveness. It's a wonderful invention that comes to us out of the Jewish tradition, I believe, with provisos and understandings, but some wonderful things can be accomplished through the concept of forgiveness, of being open to the future and freed from the dead hand of the past. A number of years ago, I heard a wonderful sermon delivered at Chautauqua Institution in Western New York State. He talked about a man he knew from his area in Pennsylvania by the name of Al Masters. He was married and had a little boy, a small business. He considered himself blessed. But just before Christmas one year, his son was killed by in a traffic accident involving a 15-year-old boy who was driving without a license. He was filled with a deep desire for revenge. He wanted that 15-year-old boy to be brought before the full power of the law, even though he wouldn't be tried as an adult, but he wanted whatever the law said to be thrown, the book to be thrown at him. It was close to Christmas, and he went with his wife to church on Christmas Eve. He hadn't been to church for quite a while. The service deeply affected him, and he began to weep. On Christmas Day, he set out to find out more about the young man who had killed his son. he found that that boy had come from a broken home, that he lived with his mother, who was an alcoholic. He met the boy and gave that boy a job in his shop. He later took him into his home even. And that boy, as a man, says that Al Masters is the most saintly person he has ever known. Well, what was it in Al Masters that enabled him to act in this creative, redemptive, forgiving way? I think it's something that's possibly in each of us, a basic receptivity to the everlasting light of love, courage, yea, even commitment. So may it be with all of us as we consider these things during the Jewish High Holy Days. Amen.